morning. Happy day 2 of Org Dev. Thank you for being up and joining us. I see everyone's having breakfast, starting their daily caffeine intake. I am trying to do the same. So my name is Beth Messich. I am the principal and founder of Beth Messich Coaching and Consulting. So I do executive leadership coaching and talent management and learning and development consulting to help organizations build their leadership pipeline for the future. I am also happily in my second year as an Org Dev committee member and facilitator and speaker. So some of you are in my session on Tuesday. And then I'm really happy this morning to be moderating our panel on the connected culture, a revolutionary approach to culture shift in organizations. So I was particularly happy that this is the topic that we're talking about because, I think in years past, there was this idea at work that, there's work and then there's life, and they are separate. And you keep emotions in your life, not at work. So you get up in the morning, you put your emotions in the box on the bedside, you go to work. And that was just flawed thinking from the beginning, right? Number one, because we're human beings and we're experiencing emotions all the time, but also this idea that work is this thing that happens in a very discrete 9 to 5 time frame, Monday through Friday, just like this little box of 40 hours. Work and life are constantly blending together. And so the idea that our emotions are something that we aren't experiencing all the time just makes no sense, right? And I think organizations have been realizing that. That's become more and more apparent in the last 10 to 15 years. And in the last 3 years, for reasons I do not need to outline, I think it's become even more apparent, right? So I'm excited this morning because we've got a panel of both practitioners, but also a business leader who have navigated cultural shifts using things like emotional intelligence, attachment theory, and a focus on relationships, which is incredibly relevant. So once I have our panelists introduce themselves in just a minute, here's how we're gonna spend the next hour. I have some questions for them, as you might expect. And it's really a discussion, right? This is just a conversation. I would love, as we're talking, as things come up for you, as your questions come up, jot them down. We're gonna keep at least 10, 15 minutes at the end for your questions, so I'll be keeping time. If you see me looking at my phone, it's me checking the time. I'm not like on TikTok or something. I wanna make sure that we have time for your questions, and then we'll wrap up. So does that sound like an okay way to start our morning? Are we all on board? Yes, can I get a hearty yes? I wanna know the caffeine's working. Yes, excellent, okay, thank you. All right, so I would love for you all to introduce yourself. Lola, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much. First, I just want to say how wonderful I feel about this conference and to be here with all of you and my friends, my colleagues, Rocky and Amanda. I feel like there's a revolution is happening in the relationship in terms of the workplace, and I want you to be all part of that revolution, and hopefully you will see how it can impact your company. I'm an organizational psychologist and founder of EMC Leaders. I am the developer of the emotional connection process, or EMC as we call it. And it's really EMC is based on the last 50 years of attachment science, adult bonding, and the science of emotional connection. And it basically teaches people and companies, teams, managers, how to nurture, strengthen, and repair relationships. Repair is the key here. And what the research really shows is that when managers have a really strong relationship with their direct report, and when team members have a strong relationship with each other, they can accomplish so much more. They are much more productive, they are motivated, they are resilient to stress. They can really deal with whatever coming at them. But it's the relationship is the key. And so I have used the EMC process with over 900 cases, helping companies deal with workplace conflict, engagement, turnover, culture shift, and it has really produced outstanding results. I have written a book, Emotional Connection, with my colleague, and created online certification programs for managers to know how to go through the reconnection process, for employees to learn the language of emotions,
Yep.
and train the trainer for certified trainers so they can continue to integrate emotional connection into their culture. We have a podcast called The Leader in You, and we really are here to educate, to share the experience. So I'm really, really excited to be here. Thank you, Beth, for leading us.
Absolutely. Rocky.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and I echo what you said. Very happy to be here. It's an honor. My name is Rocky Banzaladze. I am a Chief Operating Officer and a partner of Agora Space Technologies. It's an aerospace company in Orange County, California. But in the last 25 years, I've had the opportunity to serve in various senior leadership roles throughout financial services industry. And when Lola and I'm sure we'll speak about this a little bit later, when we got to know each other, I immediately grabbed this topic because I've been fascinated with observing leaders and organizations in my experience where people build some amazing cultures. I mean, we all have good experiences and bad experiences, but some of these individuals were able to create incredibly cohesive, engaging, and highly performing teams and organizations. And I wanted to learn more. Later on, I actually studied this at academic level. We call it relational leadership. And I met Lola by chance you were finishing a board meeting, and I was finishing a lunch, and we were introduced, and I got to know her a little bit. And then later, I attended one of her lectures, and I was hooked. I said I wanted to learn more. And I persuaded her to actually work with me over a period of months as a leader to learn more about this process. A lot of great things came out of this, so much so that I actually decided to put my entire management team through this training. And there were some extraordinary results that came out of this, and I hope to share some of those examples with all of you today. But I guess that comes later, so good to be here, and hopefully we learn together. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Amanda.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. So nice to see you all. As my colleagues so graciously shared, we're so excited to be here and have this exchange with you. My name is Amanda Vikramasinghe. I'm currently a professor at Pepperdine University. I work predominantly with PhD students. I teach in global leadership and international affairs. The last 15 years or so, I've been in all types of different academic roles and consulting roles as well. My research spans between global leadership, international affairs, and foreign policy. Currently, I'm focusing primarily working with my PhD students. Essentially, I start with them as they start their coursework, and I get them to the end as they finish their dissertation. I am such an advocate for the EMC process. The way Lola and I connected was about 5 years ago. Being a researcher, I was fascinated to see how the EMC process can actually apply to organizational affairs. So that's where we joined forces, and we worked on several projects together, researching the EMC process and identifying how the alignment happens. So looking forward to sharing all that information with you today. And on a personal note, I'm a new mom, so I recognize the importance of emotions more than ever before now.
Even when you don't want to be having them.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I see it's coming full circle for me in terms of my academic world, practitioner world, and now my new and probably the most important role as a mother in terms of how emotions are really bringing us together.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
That's great.
That touched my heart.
All right, so I'm curious, how did you get into this field? Like, what was, I feel like we are gravitated to things where we need to solve a problem, so what was the pain point maybe that got you to examine emotional connection?
I feel like it's been quite a journey. I think it started with me sitting in a board meeting, watching my board members fight. The chairman was sitting next to me, and I turned to him and I said, "Why are they doing this?" He had an interesting response. He said, "I think it's because they care about each other." As a young professional, I thought to myself, well, that's kind of silly, but it was very fascinating to me. And working as an HR manager and CFO for many decades, like 27 years, and board member, I saw a lot of workplace conflicts. And I couldn't really understand how come these highly intelligent people who could solve technical problems, very difficult technical problems, could not talk to each other.
Yeah.
And I would teach them communication skills and negotiation skills and giving them insight into their past. And they just like ignoring me, and they don't want to learn the communication skills. But now we know that even if I would teach them communication skills, they would not be able to use it when they were all upset and irritated. They could only use their skills when they were calm and in emotional balance. And I think that's just like the rest of us, that's true. So I was really determined. I really wanted to find the answer because I really struggled with that. So I decided to go back to school, got my master's and doctorate in psychology. But it was after all my schooling, I was sitting in a couples workshop, out of all the places, with my husband. And the instructor was talking about attachment and how couples get into these negative cycles and negative patterns where one person becomes very demanding and aggressive and the other person shuts down and withdraws. And I'm looking at this like, oh my gosh, we have the same pattern in the boardroom. We have the same pattern in the workplace. And you know how two things collide and you have this epiphany happen?
Yeah.
And that would happen for me. I even actually said it out loud. Like, oh my gosh, workplace conflict is all about attachment. And the person next to me said, you know, don't be silly. People at work are adults. They don't need attachment. And I said, no, it's the same. It's the same. So I started to look through this attachment lens when I was working with teams and boards. And I started to bring emotionally focused approach to really help them to reconnect and repair the relationship. And I saw three things happen right away. The first thing, I saw that I got to the heart of the matter really, really fast. It was just unbelievable how quickly that happened. The second thing I saw, the transformation in behavior. Unbelievable. I never asked people to change to be less demanding or aggressive or being more engaged. I never said that to them. I was really making space for them to share their emotional experience, to share some of the pain, fears and difficulties that have, some of the triggers and raw spots, and also having this conversation. And so another third thing that really I saw is the motivation and enthusiasm just went through the roof. I'll give you an example. I was working with one particular team. The VP of sales comes in and, you know, he's very serious, shakes my hand, and he says, Lola, nice to meet you. I'm very busy. I don't even know why we're having this meeting. I can't take any more assignments. I'm just like really floored why I'm here. And I'm, okay, makes sense. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I appreciate it. And for the next 2 hours, we were talking about his emotions and how he got upset and how he got triggered. And I'm connecting, I'm having this conversation with them, kind of leading them toward this, what we call bonding conversations, where they could really open up and share in a vulnerable way, but in a safe way. After about 2 hours, and there's a CFO sitting and the CEO, after about 2 hours, he's volunteering to take on more assignments. He's like, oh, let me help you with that. Oh, let's have a meeting with that. What changed? What made a big difference? Well, we know that we are homo vinculum. We are the ones who bond. We need emotional connection for us to thrive. When we lose that connection with people we depend on, we can't deal with anything. Our prefrontal cortex is offline at that moment. As soon as I connect them on the emotional level, I'm not talking about content, I'm not talking about who is right, who is wrong. I'm giving them space. I'm leading them through this conversation where they can really tune to each other. The motivation happens. It's like you opening a faucet and suddenly the water just goes. I feel like it has really made a big difference.
Sure.
Yeah.
Rocky, I'm curious, how have you seen some of what Lola's talking about play out in your organization?
Yeah, there's so many examples to share, and I really enjoyed that example you just shared. There are a few that I can share today, but let me start with the easy one. One of the organizations that I worked with, I oversaw a large division. There were senior managers. There were about 10 or 15 of them. And I remember one of the issues that we had was the company just bought this huge CRM software, millions of dollars spent. And after about 8 months, 9 months into it, just people were not using it. Just teams were not using it. Leaders were coming up short. And I found myself constantly preaching. it wasn't getting done. And when it wasn't getting done, and I'm a pursuer, that I've learned that through Lola. So I was preaching. I'm like, I was talking about why is it important and what I was expecting from them and how it can be done and why it's not done, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a repeated cycle and just things were not getting better. So I actually approached Lola. This is the time where we started working together. And Lola asked me if I had an example like this that we can start working together on. I said, yeah, absolutely. Here's one. Struggling with it. So we had conversations, and what changed for me in that moment wasn't them, it was starting to understand what was triggering me as a leader.
Yeah.
And what I learned about myself at that moment is that what was triggering me is that my fear that I was failing as a leader. In the end, the buck stopped at me, right? I just was not able to do it through them or with them. So I remember we brought them together. I asked Lola, could you come in, just observe, like see how we do this? And of course we prepped. So we start. And I said, okay, we're going to talk about this CRM issue that we have. And I could just see, people just like step back. Oh God, again. I said, okay, I realized that there's a problem here, but I've been approaching this very incorrectly from the very beginning. So there was a pause. Okay, that's a good sign. I said, well, I think what happens is that when things don't get done, it triggers me as a leader because I realize that maybe I'm failing. I'm failing with all of you. I'm failing as a leader. I'm not able to do this. And really started to focus on me and what my fears were when things were not getting done. And I also told them, hey, when some of you guys do this and your teams do it, what happens to me is that I feel like this burden's just lifted. I go home, I'm a better husband, I'm a better dad, and I'm actually a better leader for the rest of the team. So it makes me happy. And I remember one of the individuals who were sitting up front and probably the biggest culprit of his team's not doing this, and turns around right away and says, Rocky, I never understood how much pain this was causing you. And obviously it's not a miracle, right? It's not just from one moment to another, but I can tell you within a week of that meeting, I never had to talk about the CRM implementation again. So that's an example.
I love that example. It reminds me, like words come to mind from probably the modern sage of our time, Taylor Swift. It's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me. And I don't mean to suggest that you were the problem, but I love that I think it's really tempting to be like, well, what is everyone else doing that's wrong? As opposed to saying, what's my role in this? And it sounds like by taking that responsibility and actually that vulnerability to say like, hey, this is what's happening to me, and telling your team that was the unlock.
Absolutely. In the end, right? I mean, I wanted that connection with them.
Yeah.
And once they felt that, then the content was easy. The rest of the stuff was easy.
Yeah. Amanda, I'm wondering if you can speak to what Rocky's talking about there is not easy to do. Like you're saying it like it's easy. It's not easy to do. How can leaders get to that place where they feel comfortable being vulnerable and thinking about emotional connection?
Absolutely. So I look at it from the academic lens, and this is one of the reasons I joined forces with Lola. As someone who researches emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, and as a consultant, I help companies create global alliances. I realized that the missing piece, as you so well said, is the emotions and the lack of social and relationship capital. And once they're more comfortable speaking in regards to relationship capital and really understanding each other, that alliance building is so much more natural. So what I realized in my work is most leaders are in a lot of ways uncomfortable being vulnerable, and that's where emotions are so necessary, especially if you're in the process of moving your company into an international enterprise or expanding your global footprint. You need to understand how to be vulnerable in all those situations and realize that you may not know everything, but rely on your fellow colleague, be vulnerable, and have that relationship capital to essentially come to a better place. That's where EMC really comes in, because Lola's very profound methodology outlines a process that all leaders can follow with time. Of course, it's never an overnight process. That will help you not only reach more of your constituents, your team members, but also build that strong social and relationship capital.
Yeah, and what you're getting to the heart of, as practitioners here in the room, I think we all know that research shows that the number one predictor of a high-performing team is psychological safety, and one of the ways we build psychological safety is sharing vulnerability. So I'm curious how, for all of you, how do we make it safe so that people feel comfortable sharing emotions in the workplace?
One of the things that we do in the process is create safety. And create safety, we recognize that it's not the people who need to change. It's not like I'm a bad guy, you're the bad guy. It's the cycle. Think of interaction as a dance, and emotion is the music of the dance. If you want to teach people to dance a waltz, for example, and there's a tango music is playing, you can't do that. So you have to change the music for them to dance to the same dance. One of the things that we do in the process is, number one, we de-escalate. We de-escalate by teaching people the language of emotions. We make it comfortable for them. We acknowledge, we accept their emotional experience. And we say, you don't have to agree to the content, but let's make space for each person's experience, because they are all valid. No matter what's happening for the person's experience, emotional experience is valid for them. We make it very explicit, and we have tools for employees to learn how to even identify emotions. This is what teams taught me when I was working with them. It's like I would come and say, like, how do you feel? They would give me one word, frustrated. And how do you feel? Well, frustrated. And then I recognized, like, they don't even have the language for emotions. So I created a language for emotions and teaching them, look, there are surface emotions, there are softer emotions, and then there are primary emotions that really drive all the disconnections, and connection is those primary emotions. So they can be more aware what is happening for them. And then what are the triggers? And let's identify the negative cycle. So we know that people got to the first stages when they can come in and say, we got stuck in a negative cycle. See, now they're aligned. They're aligned together to fight the cycle, not each other. That changes people in all the different ways. And now we know, like, for example, suppression of emotions is very damaging. It's one of the key causes of negative cycles when you suppress emotions. And there are three things happen with suppression of emotions. Number one, it's hard work. It wipes you out physiologically and emotionally. The number two is you can't focus on anything else because you are so tuned into really putting your emotions, suppressing your emotions. And number three, it makes you more anxious. So Matthew Lieberman, who is a researcher of emotions, he talked about just by naming emotions, ordering emotions, and making sense of emotions, our amygdala, the emotional part of the brain, relaxes, and our prefrontal cortex comes back online. It takes time for people to be comfortable to talk about emotions. I'll give you an example. I was working with one executive team, and the vice chair comes in, and you know, we talk about emotions because they want to get more engagement in the board meeting. And I would ask him what's happening for him before he goes to the board meeting, at the board meeting, after, and he's like, Lola, I'm a very private person. Don't ask me about emotions. And I said, okay, it makes sense. I hear you. It makes sense. That's very difficult. It's very uncomfortable for people at first. Yeah. And then he would come to the meetings and he would just watch. He would observe how other people shared emotions and how I would respond and how would they respond to each other. And after about 8 months, he comes in after a board meeting and he says, I want to share my emotions. I felt demeaned. I felt like I was nobody. I felt completely ignored. And the CEO, who was already knew this process, he did not dismiss his feelings. He did not defend. He turned to him and he said, thank you for sharing. What can we do to make it feel safe for you? And he said, just be there. Just be there. And sometimes managers, it's hard for them to know how to be there. They are trained like, what is your problem? I have a solution for you.
Yeah.
And that just goes shoo, very fast. In the process of teaching people how to respond to emotion, you don't have to be a therapist. You don't have to be a psychologist to know how to work with emotion. You're a human being. We can all learn how to respond to emotions, how to articulate emotions in a safe way so we don't come across as judgmental. But everything, we are so attuned to each other, our tone of voice, our facial expression, everything triggers us in the workplace. And when we don't know how to talk about how to catch those moments, we lose the moment of bonding.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and I think you're calling out something really important, right? Leaders, I know as I was learning to be a leader, we're taught to be problem solvers. And people's emotions aren't problems for us to solve, I think is what you're saying,
exactly.
right? how did you see this play out for your team, Rocky?
Yeah, in a very similar way. It almost, I love how Lola talks about organization doesn't matter, the industry doesn't matter, content doesn't matter. What really matters is that interaction between, well, I think it starts with two individuals and then applies to the team, because culture is created one way or the other. Unless you deliberately create a culture, then the culture creates itself.
Yeah.
It is about, to me at least personally, was learning through this process and observing. It's about learning and understanding yourself first as a leader. Because I think it's hard to address something else or someone else or a team if you don't have the skill set to first identify that yourself. So it's almost kind of like going to the doctor's office, right? And then something's aching, and then when they find here's what it is, it's almost like, okay, now I know what it is. Now let's figure out how we're going to solve it, right? So, but it starts with you. That's one.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is finding the right language. And a lot of times that is the most difficult thing. It's not about defending your actions, or it's not about proving that you're right or they were wrong, etc. It's more about finding the language to how do you navigate through this conversation. And it's not the quote unquote HR conversation. It's more of a human interaction with someone that you depend on, someone that depends on you. And I think we all had that kind of experiences. I believe if you all of us start thinking about whether it's a family level or just your boss or somebody that reports to you, there's always been some things where, you walk away and like, that was weird, right? And I'm sure they feel the same way. So finding that language and surrounding yourself with, I think, the people who can help you with navigate through that. That's been the real game changer for me and the teams that I worked with.
Yeah. So we're also talking about this idea of better understanding our emotions, better understanding others' emotions to nurture relationships. Amanda, how do you suggest that leaders do that?
So to nurture relationships, I think the most simplest way to put it is just ask really good questions. Ask your team members, your colleagues, your peers, how are you doing? What's been going on? I know the deadline is approaching next week. What can I do to help you? Posing those open-ended questions creates a trusting environment, and of course that increases psychological safety as well, which is one of the pillars of EMC. For me personally, with all the teams I'm a part of, I make it a point before we even touch the agenda for our team meeting to spend about a good 20 to 30 minutes just catching up, because then it humanizes the process. And that's where we can be vulnerable the most and brings emotions to the surface. Now, Lola mentioned about that negative cycle we go into, especially if we're always coming to a meeting or an interaction where you're trying to solve a problem. But before you do that, take some time and get to know each other. You will be so surprised by what some people are actually going through in their life. And knowing that they have someone to turn to is comforting. And that's going to help not only build relationship capital, but also to establish trust. So my advice in terms of discussing emotions is take some time to get to know your fellow peers and colleagues. You will see that you probably have more in common than you do in terms of what you don't agree upon. So take time, get to know each other, and of course that's going to foster a collaborative environment, which in turn will help you bring emotions to the surface.
Well, and we're relational human beings, right? Yesterday, with the keynote that kicked us off yesterday, I think Devin had us do an activity, right, where we talked to one or two people next to us and said, okay, find 3 things that you have in common. It's not that hard, right? It's not hard to find what we have in common, and I think it's a lot easier to see someone as the enemy when you don't know a lot about them. Like they're just sort of an avatar for the thing that's in the way, right? Which goes back to what you're talking about with attachment theory. So how does that attachment theory sounds kind of clinical, right? It sounds kind of academic. How does that come to life? How do you bring that to life for people in organizations? How do you help leaders think about that?
First of all, attachment theory was founded by John Bowlby, who was really looking at the mothers and children relationships and what happens to them. There's a great video on YouTube called Still Face Experiment. The baby and the mother interacting with each other, and then they ask the mother to go still and silent. And then you watch what the baby does. And the baby goes through 4 stages of getting the mother back and what's happening with the baby. And so what researchers learned is that the adults go through the same stages as the baby. It's inherent in us. So the baby first reaches, then the baby shrieks, makes noise, then the baby turns away, then the baby cries. And when the mother comes back, the baby engages immediately and just as before. So all of that teaches us that our relationship, the way we impact each other, especially when people stonewall and withdraw, they feel like, oh, I'm withdrawal, like I'm not doing anything, like what's the big deal? But guess what? The big deal is when you withdraw, my amygdala goes on fire. And now I'm becoming more anxious and demanding, and all of that drama happens immediately when people can't reach for each other. So an attachment relationship will look and say the reason why people acting that way, or the reason why people distancing or disengaging, because there's a break in a connection. Because there's a break, there's some hurt feelings. You know, Devin talked about yesterday, everybody wants to feel valued, important, seen. Well, that's a moment when that attachment fear, I'm rejected, I'm not valued, I'm not important, interjected. So everything that we do, we're really trying to get the connection back. Anxious people are trying to complain, criticize, or blame because they are anxiously to getting that connection back, but they are doing it ineffectively. The withdrawer people, they want to distance themselves because they don't want more disconnection happening. So that doesn't work either. The problem is they get stuck in those moments. We all have done all of those things. But when we get stuck in those moments, that perpetual behavior continues to create more distance and more disconnection. And then people started to feel really alone and isolated. So when we look at the attachment through the attachment lens and we see that people are either disengaged or they're in conflict, it's because there's a negative cycle. So you could right away notice the relationship shifts and people are different now. They don't have skills, they can't collaborate, they're not engaged. There's a negative cycle happening. And sometimes, you know, I've worked with a finance team, for example, that person says, I don't need to have a relationship with my manager. I'm here to do a job. I'm here to do my tasks. Well, through the process, we have learned that she has become very unproductive and she has been ineffective. She cannot sleep at night because she cannot come to her manager for questions, for collaborations, for asking. That bridge is broken. And so she doesn't sleep at night. She has all kinds of different health issues. And when they were started to reconnect and repair the relationship, her motivation became again up online. She sleeps better at night. Her health issue disappeared. Well, that tells us something. That tells us that relationships are so key for us. And emotional connection is a glue that holds that bond together. Rocky talked about we depend on each other at work. And that dependency automatically creates an attachment. And in our brain turns on our bonding needs. So when we lose the connection, our brain goes into panic, not because you're immature or because you're not smart enough, because we have a mammalian brain. And that mammalian brain tells us is that being alone and with no one watching your back is dangerous. Again, learning from the teams that I worked with, I created a reconnection form, a reconnection roadmap, step-by-step process, how managers can lead these bonding conversations where people can reconnect and repair the relationship. The conversation is not awkward, but it's a dance. It's like you moving into the people into that music. If you want to change the dance, you have to change the music. And the fastest way to change the music is through emotions. You change emotions with emotion. Learning and understanding the process and understanding really looking through that attachment lens makes a big difference.
Years ago when I started to learn about emotional intelligence and when I learned and understood that when information enters our brain, it comes in through the amygdala, which is where emotions are processed, before it gets to the front of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, where you have thought processed. And for me, it was like, I think you could actually see the light bulb going off above my head because I thought, oh my God, we're wired to be emotional. This is why I phrase it myself sometimes of when my mouth gets ahead of my brain. It's because the information's stuck back in the amygdala. So I love that you're giving some language around this. I want to make sure in a few minutes we'll go to questions. Before we do that, Rocky, I just want to ask you talked about implementing this process across your organization. How did you do that, and what results did you see?
I've heard this before. As leaders, when you blink, your people feel like a hurricane. Right? I've heard this term, and what I've learned through my experiences is that you don't have to necessarily be a leader to have an effect on others. So I'll give you an example on this one, and I'll answer your question.
Yeah.
And I'll put you on the spot, sorry. So we scheduled this call early on, I think last month or so, to talk about logistics of this, what time we had to show up, etc. And I had all the intention in the world to be on that call with Lola to learn how this is going to play out. And something big happened at work that I had to be there. So I text Lola, right, about half an hour before the meeting. I said, Lola, I'm so sorry, I can't be on the call. I will call you later on, and then I'll catch up. Is that okay? And Lola responded very sweet and lovingly, but I sensed that there was I put her in very uneasy position. So I said to everybody, guys, hang on, I need like 2 minutes, I need to call somebody. So I stepped out right away. I called Lola, and I said, and very simple things, that I think I said something like, listen,
You're important to me. That's what you said.
I did.
You're important to
and
me.
I swear to God, we didn't rehearse this. So, and I just said something, a few things like, this is important. I just don't want you to feel that way. How did you feel in that moment when I did that?
I felt so relieved because I felt like, oh my gosh, this is not important to Rocky. This is the need, right? We need to know that we are important. And when Rocky, when you explicitly made it, Lola, this is important to me. I care about what you're doing. I want to be there for you. My gosh, my nervous system relax. I'm like, I don't care about what we have to do. We will figure it out. But all of that thing just went away. All that fear it relaxed me.
So I think this is the example.
On clouds.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, I'm happy that was.
Did you know that you have such an impact on me?
I think that's what I was trying to get to, is that we do have impact on each other, whether we believe it or not. And title has nothing to do with it. Yeah. Titles have absolutely nothing to do with it. So when you ask what kind of impact you see, I see trust goes up immediately. Trust goes up. I see engagement goes up. Yeah. And what I always worried about is that through all these engagements, trust, collaboration, inclusiveness, all of these words, performance goes up. Right. The downtime for the conflict or the negative cycles, it just diminishes and performance goes up. So that's the results that I've observed.
Well, and I think that's a great call out, right? I think when you've got leaders who are like, people are adults here, as if you get like a package of emotional intelligence when you get your adult card, or I don't have time for this kind of stuff. They're not making the connection that this isn't like the nice to do. This isn't the we're giving everybody ice cream and an afternoon off. This is literally going to be tied to your business results. So I love that. All right, I want to make sure we have time for audience questions. I think Mallory, you've got a microphone. So who has a question?
My question is, maybe Lola, this is for you perhaps, but say hypothetically you have a CEO who is not emotionally intelligent, is not interested in emotional intelligence, and may even have something else neurologically going on that just makes it really hard for her to see emotion or acknowledge emotion. Because I think what I'm guessing too is so much of the success that you had with this program is that you are open to talking about your own emotion and your challenges and showing that vulnerability with your team. And as a CEO, that's incredibly powerful to have someone in that leadership role do that. How do you crack the code with the leader that's not willing to do that? This is a big question, but just throwing it out there.
What's your name?
Sarah.
Sarah.
Yeah.
I think it's a great question. I get that question all the time, and I think whatever team is open to do that, they will have an impact on the rest of the organization. I worked with a biotech company. The executive team was not interested in this. The commercial team brought this in. And now the manufacturing team saw how the commercial team has been changing and the conversation. And now they said, we want to learn that too. And we want to learn that. So I think the CEO is not open because they don't feel safe. Number one, they don't have the language. Number two, they never had the role model. So what we do is we create, whoever is open, we are becoming the role models. We create that environment for them. So when they get stressed, we look for that moment. We can validate their emotions. They can experience, what does it feel like? Because it's all about the experience. Einstein said knowledge is experience, 99%. Everything else is just information. They have the longing for connection. There's no question about it. We are tapping into the most powerful motivational force in our brain. is that longing for connection. The CEO doesn't show, but they do have the longing for connection. So we are demonstrating to them, because they have never seen what it looks like, what it feels like. It's scary. They are standing on the cliff. We're telling them to jump, and they're saying, no, it's so scary for us. So we are creating safety for them. We are validating. We're using the language that we have learned in the emotional connection to give them that experience. Right. And that's going to help them to come closer. Every time when we become more vulnerable with ourselves and for example, say, how important this is for you. I know this is so difficult, but I just want you to know, I know how much you care. These are attachment needs. These are attachment language that we teach. We say, make implicit explicit, saying, I know it's difficult. I know how much you care about this organization. I know how much you care about the people. Most of the CEOs feel like people don't really get them, how scared they are sometimes, how much worry they have, how much they care, because they don't share that as openly. So if you can tap into that, really get into their emotional experience, and really understand how difficult it is for them when they don't know how to share. It takes a lot of courage, Sarah. Absolutely. It takes a lot of courage, but it takes determination. So I want you to know there's hope.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jackie, and I'm from the beautiful island of Barbados. So thank you all very, very much for bringing to life a topic that is very dear and close to my heart. Those of you who are working in academia, I'm just wondering, how are we preparing our graduates for this kind of intervention? How are we preparing them? Because sometimes you find, for a person like myself who spends some time in academia, it is very much about me focused. And there's a lot of competition to get, that degree, to get to be summa cum laude, all those kinds of things. So how do we get our graduates to embrace this connectivity? And in terms of looking at it from a global perspective, does that impact the socialization? Does the culture, how does that impact this concept? Thank you.
Thank you. That's such a great question. And my answer, there's two parts to it. So now with academia, the curricula for graduate students, it's changing quite drastically just to keep up with the global demands and to essentially prepare them for the global workforce. The number one skill that organizations globally look for in terms of new graduates is multicultural fluency. And under the umbrella of multicultural fluency is emotion, and ensuring that our students are equipped with the skill sets, competencies, behaviors to work across cultures and be effective in those relationships. So it's moving away from that notion of it's me, and moving more towards how do we create this collaborative environment where we can all work, especially now with remote work and working from anywhere phenomenon. You have to know how to interact with individuals from different backgrounds, ethnicities, languages, and so on and so forth. So having conversations around emotion and building that relationship capital is essential now for the global workforce. And in terms of your second question, the impacts of emotion globally, again, when you are entering into an international environment or expanding your international footprint, whether you're an organizational leader or an academic, you have to understand how to work effectively across different cultures and boundaries. And so this notion of boundary spanning has emerged. And again, with boundary spanning, one of the key areas is emotion, being able to have those tough conversations, being vulnerable, letting individuals know how important you are to them, and vice versa. That creates a natural trust factor that will, of course, elevate psychological safety and enhance your cultural intelligence. So academia is changing. It's no longer how do I essentially get this new position after I graduate. It's more so how do I fit into this more global workforce with enhanced multicultural fluency.
And just to the point, as you can imagine, they all bring their own style. You have somebody from Argentina, or you have somebody from Greece, or you have somebody from Canada, and they all respond to emotions differently. What we found is by teaching them this process and just the language, everybody started to speak that same language. Mm-hmm. And they could really turn to each other, and that's what we want. We want not just people to have happy employees, we want people to know that they can turn to each other in moments of stress. One of the key questions in attachment is, are you there for me? Mm-hmm. Are you there for me? And ARE really translates to, are you accessible to me? Are you accessible to me, that you are willing to listen to hear my emotions? Are you responsive to me? Can you respond to my emotion? Can you really feel my pain? Can you see it on my face? Can you be with me? And are you emotionally engaged with me? So if you ask yourself that question, are you there for me, in response to your relationship with your boss, with your manager, with your team? And if the answer is a resounding yes, you have a secure attachment. If the answer to that question, are you there for me, is a maybe or no, you have negative cycles going on. You will have a little disconnection happening for you. So you're not feeling safe. So every time you come to the meeting with that person, you're going to be on guard. Your brain automatically will be on guard and vigilant for threat. I think emotion is the key to that change.
Yeah. I think we have a question back here.
My question is around, if you're doing that, so as a leader, an employee, if you are asking those questions, seeking for that emotional connection, and you're getting responses that are positive, but the behaviors aren't showing up in that same way, what are the actions or characteristics of what that looks like from a tangible standpoint? Because there's many times leaders and employees have very positive exchanges, but the actual behaviors don't shift, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking from concept to pragmatism, what does that look like in the workplace?
Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
Thank you, great question. So I would say, if the conversation's positive, if the interaction's positive, so like people walking away from the conversation feeling like, okay, this was good, but the actions don't change, then I would say that conversation didn't get to the root problem. And additional conversations need to take place where that root problem needs to be identified. Right. Now, I think the trickiest part in that is finding the right language to navigate through that, because it's almost like your first reaction, or my first reaction there would be like, well, we talked about this and it's still not done, right? So it's like, so what went wrong? So now it's blaming conversation. So that's been the experience where you feel like you accomplished something, you feel great about it. Somebody asks, well, how did the conversation go with your boss? I'm like, oh, it was good. We connected, I think we're good. And then you come out of it and it's the same thing next week, right? So then I would say, okay, didn't get there. Got to go back and do it.
One of your handouts, it says 5 quick wins to better bond your team. I think number 2 says share impact versus feedback. I think you can share feedback when you have a very secure relationship. You can tell people what they can improve, because then their brain is not going to get alarmed. Yeah. But to your point, Rocky, if the behavior continues, you have to think about, how do I share my impact? What is happening with me? How does this behavior impact me? And what's happening with their team? And it needs to be emotional experience. We are looking for a new corrective emotional experience to change behavior. You cannot tell people to change behavior. It won't be long term. They would change it for 5 minutes, and then they go back to themselves again. It has to be an emotional experience where they get it. They get the point. And because there's a dependency, because they long for connection, because there is a need for connection, you are important to them. If they're still not changing, like Rocky says, that means we didn't address their hurt, their block. The block is still there. So that's where the attachment, again, lens comes in. Something is not talked about. So we're going to have another conversation to really understand what is blocking them and how does this impact me.
Yeah, I think as leaders, we need to be in tune with that. I mean, that's probably the number one job that we have. Because we have to recognize that we have big impact on others, right, whether we want it or not. And it can be a split second. And my intention was never to dismiss Lola, right? I mean, that was not the case at all. But she could interpret it that way had I not made that call.
Yeah, exactly.
And even though we have a good, trusting relationship, me not making the call would have triggered us both.
Exactly.
I'm Sarah, and I'm going to actually go back to and add on a little bit to what the other Sarah said earlier. A situation in a leader, and it can be of a small team, where that leader is adamantly against speaking about emotions, which you did talk about. Is there a point where you have to kind of stop and say you're either on board or you're not? Like, it doesn't sound like you're going to force anybody into these conversations, that you're going to wait, but we certainly have some people who absolutely refuse and have for years, and then of course make the comments about their team. And I have to, in my own way, laugh and go, show the mirror to yourself, because you're a reflection of your team. And if you don't have that leader on board and their team is, or maybe they're not, but let's just say the team is, and they're wanting to learn, I don't understand how they can get psychological safety, because the person that they have to turn to is not willing to speak that language to be there to support them. So is there a point where you have to either enforce something or have that conversation? How does that work? Because it's like you've got those cycles going on, and at some point, like, you have to do something, right?
That's a very good question, and often a question that comes across the research too. How do you have that conversation if someone is completely against having this conversation around emotions? The research states that it takes up to at least 5 to 10 years for someone to really be able to transcend emotions out. But from an organizational standpoint, of course, you want to have those conversations immediately. And if someone is completely against it, the best thing to do, at least from the research angle, is to continue to have those conversations, because they will see that there's a turning point where they have to essentially jump on board. Because if they don't, it's going to impact the productivity of the team and how that aligns with the organizational objectives, right? Everything has alignment. So eventually they will turn. But you, as the team members, need to continuously invite them to the conversation, because there's always an impetus that's going to help them shift their mindset and get on board with discussing the emotional process. Because they will see, especially if they're a numbers person, how the team productivity, if it drops, how that impacts the numbers. And that is a good correlation for them to understand, okay, maybe I need to start thinking about this a little bit more. So you need to identify what is it that's important to that individual and find that alignment, because when they see the alignment, they're more naturally to open up about and discuss emotions.
Thank you. I'll say one quick thing and turn it over
Yes,
to Lola.
sure.
You're not alone. We all experienced that, one way or the other. And it's one thing to address situations like this when somebody reports to you, right? And I would say that's probably a little easier. Still need to find the right language. It's a lot harder to influence up. And depending on your personality, whether you're a pursuer or withdrawer, that can be also harder. But I think there's a way, and that's probably the most courageous way to do it. When you find a way, not if, when you find a way to get there with that individual, I think the rewards are significantly more than any other situation. I mean, when you influence your CEO or a board member in a way that they want to be influenced, and power is the wrong word in this, but that's a real powerful tool.
Yeah, exactly.
But there is a way, and you're definitely not alone in that.
Right. And I think what Amanda talked about in terms of the finding the alignment, just as a statistics point of view, 50% of people who leave because of workplace conflict, they're not getting along with a coworker or manager. Companies lose millions, billions of dollars because there's constant time down because people are not showing up, or there's a discourse and you have to spend now energy to get people back online. So CEOs like numbers. And we have a great formula on a little handout how you can calculate actually what is costing your company. And this is done by CPP Global Report, the people who do Myers-Briggs. They have done this research. 3 hours per week per employee is spent on workplace conflicts. Just think about how much money that is. That's a huge motivator for any CEO, I think, to see the benefit of that.
Yeah. So We are at time. I think we are almost over time, which is probably the sign of a good conversation. So before we wrap up, you mentioned the handouts on the table. Do you want to talk for a minute about that, what people have there?
I want to say that the 5 quick wins is a great start. You can actually design a whole workshop about 5 quick wins. There's a QR code if you want to schedule a free assessment with us. We will provide you a roadmap, what you can do with your team and how to address the negative cycle. The most important thing for you to think about is be curious. Recognize the negative cycle. Start to pay attention to those things and be hopeful. I feel like emotional connection is really creates an environment where people can blossom. You kind of like create an ecological niche for people to thrive because you are tapping into that emotional connection that we all long for. And I want you to feel hopeful. I mean, next week, I'm going to be celebrating our 42nd anniversary with my husband, okay? I just want you to think about it. I don't think I would be able to say that 15 years ago because we were in like brinks. The negative cycles were all over. But we have 2 children and we have 5 grandkids who are learning this process now for the last 10 years. They can turn to each other, teenagers, they can turn to each other and say, what I need is to know that you really care about me, because in that moment when you are playing by yourself and I want to play with you, you turned away.
Yeah.
They have these conversations with each other. They can say, your feelings are valid, I care about you. Even though like I did something, I just want you to know you are important to me. These words are not heard from kids or from teenagers or from adults.
No.
So, and I want you to know that there is significant possibilities that you can experience in your teams, in your groups, in your work, where you can thrive yourself.
Hashtag goals. Yeah, okay, that was wonderful. So I wish I could start all of my mornings with conversations like this. This is a great way to start the day. Lola, Rocky, Amanda, thank you so much. I think they can potentially find you at the table out front.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
to all of you.
Thank you.
Yeah.